I will.
Hey, how y'all doing?
Good, good.
How are you doing, Will?
Yeah, Donna's saying, how are you, Will?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good, good.
We missed you.
We might have tried to come today, but we've got guests flew in from the Philippines, and I've got to take him right after this. Pretty soon after this, I got to take him, do some little bit, help him get some stuff. But then we're going on down to a couple hours south to meet his ride to Houston. And Monday he's got pre-surgical stuff, and on Tuesday they'll be doing pretty major surgery on him. So
Okay.
Remember Danny.
Danny.
Yep.
Is this Will's brother?
He's been a missionary over in the Philippines, worked with me over there.
Okay.
Good guy.
All righty. Well, everybody, good morning. Glad to have Todd here today.
You have a husband.
And that is Emily's granddad. All right. Okay, well, let's get started with announcements. Sunday, October the 23rd at 6 is our night of worship here at the North Fort Worth campus. And our fall festival is Saturday, October the 29th from 6 to 8 p.m. We'll have hay rides pulled by a tractor on our land, inflatable obstacle courses, which I hope none of you partake in. And good morning.
Did you say hello?
I did. Yeah. So for our fall festival, we are looking for donations for candy that can be handed out to the kiddos. We've also holiday donations, just a heads up. Towards the end of the month of October, we will begin taking donations for Operation Christmas Child at Community Link holiday boxes. We will be asking our entire church family to bring items for those two campaigns. Our children, leaders in training, will pack the OCC boxes and to go overseas, and our students will pack holiday food boxes for the Community Link in Saginaw. Our next new members class will be November the 13th. And that's all of our announcements.
See, it's my hair. Back.
Second.
Hi, Darlene.
I'm sorry, I didn't know we weren't on mute. We rearranged today.
We're glad to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
All right. Prayer request. Yes, Don.
That's an update on our Celebrate Recovery.
Uh-huh.
We had a training yesterday. We do have some people who come forward who want to begin to help us. In January, our vision is to start children and student ministry with also a childcare. And so we're moving ahead, but we need more workers. And so I think students going to start maybe in November, letting the church know that.
Okay.
And so just pray with us about that, because that's a
Okay.
big deal. And like they said this morning, that's one of our community outreaches, is to let people know they don't have to put alone, that we're here to walk that journey with them.
Okay.
Will,
Yes, Will. Did you have your hand up? No. Okay. Yes, Todd.
I might ask that you also pray for the Celebrate Recovery, that church that I'm a member at. It's pretty small right now. We're kind of getting started and need all the prayer we can get to really get it moving.
Okay, okay.
All right.
We will do that. We'll put that on our prayer list.
Oh, and we're thankful that Emily is feeling better now. You saw on the prayer list. She had flu B last week.
Yeah.
Everybody else having flu A, she had B. And double ear infection, and she's much better.
Oh, good,
Little girl for
good.
2 days.
Good. All right. Well, I've asked if Herb would lead us in a word of prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you thanking you for your watch care over us, your guidance over our lives, your loving us unconditionally, Father. Even though we don't deserve it, what you did on the cross for us is so incredible. And we thank you for that. Father, help us to be serious in our commitment to you and our walk with you, and to lead God-honoring lives in all that we do. We ask your blessings and healings upon these that have been mentioned today. We just pray that you would continue to make yourself real in our lives and show us the steps to take, Father, that we would walk the path that brings glory and honor to you. Be with Brother Terry today as he leads the discussion on your word, that we might grow in the likeness of you. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, Mr. Mark.
Well, some of you know me and some of you don't. My name is Mark Terry. This is my wife, Barbara. We're retired missionaries, and we joined the church recently. And you can blame Will Gottfried that we're here. Will and Darlene invited us to visit their church. We moved to Keller in August, and Will and Darlene said, well, you need to visit our church. So we did. And so you can blame them for that. And we walked into the atrium and saw Donna Burris, and then Robert walked up, and then Dave Steverson walked up, and we've known them because we're retired missionaries. And so my job, all missionaries are appointed, but they're appointed to do different jobs. For example, David Steverson was an accountant. He was a business manager. That certainly wasn't my job. I'm allergic to anything numerical. But my job was to be a seminary teacher. So I've been a seminary professor both across the Pacific and here in the United States for many years. So Will and Robert asked me if I would help with the teaching. So I'll be teaching some as time passes here. When I taught at the seminary in the Southern Philippines, my main job was to teach Old Testament. And I kind of fell into that because no one else wanted to teach it. The dean said, well, who can teach Old Testament? And nobody else volunteered. So I said, well, okay, I'll teach it. And I really enjoyed it. I love history. And really, the Old Testament, studying Old Testament, involves lots and lots of history, the history of Israel and Egypt, Babylon, Syria, many other countries. So I enjoyed teaching Old Testament, but in my life, I've mainly been a professor of missions. So at the seminaries here in America and overseas too. But today we're going to be talking, so that's my name, Mark Terry. We're going to talk about the prophet Hosea, but I thought as we begin this morning, I would give you a little background about prophets in general. The English word prophet is a translation of the Hebrew word nabi, which literally means speaker. So the prophets were speakers for God, and God called them to speak for him, to deliver his message. And that was the nature of a true prophet. God gave him a message and he spoke it, preached it to the people. So there were various kinds of prophets. You may not have thought of this, but there were writing prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. But there were non-writing prophets. There were prophets who didn't write anything that we know of, like Elijah, who the Hebrews, the Jews, considered him the greatest of the prophets. But if he wrote anything, we don't have it. We don't know about it. Elisha, who performed twice as many miracles as Elijah, he didn't write anything. Nathan, the prophet who confronted King David about his sin with Bathsheba. Nathan was a brave prophet, we would all agree, but we don't know that he wrote anything. So there were prophets who wrote down their prophecies, and there were prophets who did not, writing prophets, non-writing prophets. You may not have noticed, but in the Old Testament, they're both male and female prophets. Of course, we know about the male prophets, that's most of them, but the Old Testament describes Miriam, Moses' sister, as a prophet, Huldah, and Deborah. Remember, Deborah was a judge, but the Old Testament describes her as a Nabi, a speaker for God. So there were male and female prophets in the Old Testament. And then we talk about the major prophets and the minor prophets. I remember we were doing a book on the Old Testament there in the Philippines for our seminary extension program, and we didn't know whether to use major and minor, and because those words are true in Cebuano and in Spanish also, major, minor, that can be. And so we tried to decide. In the end, we just stuck with major and minor, because big and little, that didn't work. But really the difference between the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the minor prophets is just the length of the book. We think about the major prophets as being more important, but not necessarily. The difference is just the length of the book. And in fact, in the Hebrew Bible, all of the minor prophets were written on one scroll, and it was called the Scroll of the 12. You probably heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the scrolls they found there at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls was a scroll of the 12, a part of it. And so the minor prophets were short enough that they could all be written on one scroll, the Scroll of the 12. Another way to divide the prophets is simply by history or chronology. And so we talk about 8th century prophets, 7th century prophets, and so on. Well, the great 8th century prophets, the 700s, in Israel, the northern kingdom, were Hosea and Micah, the first two of the minor prophets. And then in Judah, the southern kingdom, Isaiah and Micah. And so Hosea was preaching, prophesying at the same time as Isaiah, the city prophet, and Micah, the country prophet. And we'll talk about Micah later in the year. But it's a real blessing to study the minor prophets. When I used to teach a course on minor prophets there in the Philippines, and the prophets have a lot to say, especially Micah, have a lot to say about the poor. And most of our students in the Philippines were the children of tenant farmers. In the old days in the South, we'd say sharecroppers. And that communicates to you. If Henry was here, it would. He's from Louisiana. But in the South, we used to talk about sharecroppers. That means farmers who didn't own their land, They just worked the land, and the owner of the land got a percentage of the crop. And Philippines, they didn't call them sharecroppers, they were called tenant farmers. And most of my students at the seminary were the children of tenant farmers, came from very poor backgrounds. And Micah had a lot to say about the oppression and persecution of the people out in the countryside. So Isaiah was the city prophet, Micah was the country prophet. Hosea probably prophesied for 30 or 40 years, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Now, I know this is unusual, but we're going to have a wedding ceremony this morning. You probably didn't expect that, and I have to say I've never performed a wedding in a Bible fellowship class. I did perform a wedding once as part of a Sunday morning worship service. That was fun. That was for one of the deacons in our church. But Robert and Donna have agreed to be married this morning, so I'm asking them to come forward. All right, if you would face each other and join hands. We don't have any flowers. Barbara, you can be the flower girl. Tom, and you be the best man.
All right. All right.
Well, friends, we are joined together today in the sight of God and the face of this company to join Robert and Donna into the holy estate of matrimony. This is an institution that is ordained by God. And we know that our own Lord Jesus Christ endorsed marriage because he participated in the wedding at Cana in Galilee. So I'm going to ask you to repeat these vows after me. Robert, will you take Donna to be your wife? Will you commit yourself to her happiness and her self-fulfillment as a person, and to her usefulness in God's kingdom? And will you promise to love, honor, trust, and serve her in sickness and in health, in adversity and prosperity, and to be true and loyal to her so long as you both shall live?
I will.
Amen. And Donna, will you take Robert to be your husband? Will you commit yourself to his happiness and his self-fulfillment as a person, and to his usefulness in God's kingdom? And do you promise to love, honor, trust, and serve him in sickness and in health, in adversity and prosperity, and to be true and loyal to him so long as you both shall live?
I did.
Amen. May God bless your union, and what God has joined together, may not man put asunder. You may now kiss the bride. Well, the teachers quarterly suggested opening the lesson with that, and I thought it was a great idea. And I asked Donna and Robert to participate, and they were good sports about it. So one time in the Philippines, the missionary said to the groom, "You may now kiss the bride," and he refused to kiss her. And so that created something of a problem. So the missionary said a second time, "You may now kiss the bride," and he still didn't kiss her. Well, the people, as you can imagine, started to laugh. And so the missionary said a third time, "You may now kiss the bride," and the groom just ran out of the church. He just ran off. And so the missionary just dismissed the folks, and one of the congregants came up later and said, "Don't worry, Pastor, he'll kiss her later." So sure enough, he did. So, well, the lesson today is all about marriage. And God used the marriage of the prophet Hosea as a living lesson, as a life illustration for the people of the northern kingdom of Israel. one of the most difficult things to forgive is betrayal. When one spouse, a husband or wife, commits adultery, the offended spouse feels betrayed. They feel rejected, and they feel terrible hurt and pain. And so God used that example from married life as a teaching tool to help the people of Israel understand how he felt about their spiritual adultery with the gods of the Canaanites, specifically Baal and Asherah. So let's look at Hosea chapter 1. Someone read for us verses 1 and 2. Hosea chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Who can read that?
When the Lord first spoke to Hosea, he said this to him: go and marry a woman of promiscuity and have children of promiscuity, for the land is committing violent acts of by abandoning the Lord. So he went and married Gomer, daughter of
Diblaim.
and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will bring the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Judah and put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the Jezreel valley. She shall conceive again and give birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to him, name her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. I will certainly take them away, but I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and I will deliver them by the Lord their God, and I will not deliver them by bow, sword, bow, sword, or war, or by horses and cavalry.
Okay, thank you, Tony. All right, so in the first verse, verse 1, we see that God called Hosea to be his prophet. And as usual in the prophets, this time is identified by the kings of Judah and Israel. That's interesting that Hosea was primarily a prophet who spoke to the people of the northern kingdom of Israel, but the kings of Judah are listed first. And three are mentioned: Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, and Uzziah. Now, you may remember the name Uzziah because Isaiah chapter 6 begins like this: in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his glory filled the temple. Yeah. And so Isaiah, as we said, preached during the time of King Uzziah. Of course, that's true of Hosea too. So that's how we know that Hosea and Isaiah were active at the same time. Hosea up in the north and Isaiah down in the south. So the Bible scholars estimate that Hosea's ministry lasted for 30 or 40 years. Same thing was true for Isaiah. It's interesting, the only king of Israel that's mentioned here in verse 1 is Jeroboam II. Even though Hosea would have prophesied during the reigns of other kings, only Jeroboam II is mentioned. Hard to know why Hosea only mentioned Jeroboam. It may be that he considered the other kings of Israel to be not legitimate. It's interesting. All the kings of Israel were wicked kings. If you study the history of the northern kingdom, Israel, they did not have one godly king, not one. They were all wicked, all evil. They all did what was sinful in God's eyes. Whereas in Judah, in the south, some of the kings were good and some were wicked. For example, Uzziah was a good king. We know that Hezekiah was a good and godly king. Of course, Josiah, the young king, led in a great spiritual renewal there in Judah. That was during the time of Jeremiah. So in the south, in Judah, there were some good and godly kings, but in the north, I'm sorry to report there was not a single one. Now, as I said, the lesson really focuses on Hosea's marriage. And what we have here is a very strange command from the Lord. If you look at verse 2, what's printed in the quarterly is the Christian Standard Bible. Now, here at the church, normally we use the English Standard Version, but the Lifeway is the publishing house for our Southern Baptist Convention. They produced some years ago, about 20 years ago now, they produced their own version of the Bible. And the reason was very simple. In the old days, like when I was a boy, they printed the King James Version in the Sunday school quarterlies. Well, people began to complain they wanted a modern version. So they started printing the New International Version, but it was very expensive. The Zondervan Publishing Corporation owned the copyright, and they were charging them an arm and a leg to use the New International Version. So Lifeway did a cost analysis and discovered it would be cheaper to produce their own Bible than to pay to use the New International Version. So they hired about 100 Bible scholars, and they produced what was called the Holman Christian Standard Bible. And about 5 years ago, it was revised, updated, and now it's called the Christian Standard Bible. And it's fine. It's a good translation done by good and godly evangelical Bible scholars. But that's where it came from, if you ever wondered. So that's why they use the Christian Standard Bible in the quarterlies. They own the copyright, so they don't have to pay. So verse 2 in the Christian Standard Bible reads like this. It said, when the Lord first spoke to Hosea, he said this to him, go and marry a woman of promiscuity and have children of promiscuity, for the land is committing blatant acts of promiscuity by abandoning the Lord. So one of the perplexing questions in Old Testament study is, what was Gomer like when Hosea married her? Was she already living an immoral life, sexually speaking, or did she begin to live that way after they married? Now, Robert and I were talking about this before the worship service started. The lesson for us is the same. The lesson ultimately for us is the same. Gomer committed physical adultery, and her physical adultery and betrayal of Hosea illustrated how the people of Israel committed spiritual adultery by worshiping Baal and Asherah, the gods of the Canaanites. So the lesson is the same one way or another, but it's really an interesting question as to what, was Gomer chaste? Was she a good girl when they got married, or was she already promiscuous? In other words, already being and living an immoral life. The Hebrew is open. The Hebrew text in the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. the Hebrew text is open to different interpretations. That's why there are various interpretations of this. In some questions in the Bible, you have a liberal position and you have a conservative position. That's not the case here. Conservative Bible scholars have different opinions. For example, I have the Christian Standard Bible Study Bible. Well, according to the Christian Standard Bible Study Bible, Gomer was already promiscuous. He was already immoral when Hosea married her. But according to the English Standard Version Study Bible, she was chaste or pure when they got married, and she fell into immorality and committed adultery after they married. And so that's the question, which is it? Well, I looked at a number of different commentaries. The writer of the Teacher's Quarterly, the writer of the Teacher's book here, is Dr. T.J. Betts from Southern Baptist Seminary up in Louisville. I know, I used to teach there, so I know T.J. His son was a journeyman. And anyway, T.J. Betts says, well, she was already immoral. And that was the position in the New American Commentary, which Lifeway publishes. So there's that. But then again, the English Standard Version Study Bible said, no, she became immoral after they married. And that was the position taken in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. And so all of these are conservative Bible reference sources. So what's the bottom line is? Well, the bottom line is we don't know for sure. My personal belief is that she became immoral after they married, because that suits the illustration, that suits the analogy better. But one way or another, after she married Hosea, she engaged in adultery. But why did God ask Hosea to marry a woman who either was already promiscuous or that God knew would commit adultery later? Why would God ask Hosea to do that? That's a profound question.
As an example, is God's relationship with Israel.
Okay. All right. God meant for it to be a living lesson, a life lesson. Okay.
He wasn't asking any more of this one than he was of his own people.
Well, that's right. Someone else.
Maybe it was more of an illustration that the people could really understand how
Mm.
it could be down there so they reach.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. My grandson would relate to that too. Well, now that could well be true. I hadn't thought of that, but I like that a lot. And Hosea did as he was told. And undoubtedly, this led to great heartache for Hosea. But God meant for Hosea's betrayal and heartache to be a lesson for the people of Israel so they could understand God's feeling of betrayal and God's heartache.
And I think too, he talks about God's love.
Yeah.
Because God loves, not because the people obey. That's something that's on a higher level that we grasp over. That's something that's my heart a lot lately. We talked about how God just looks different.
You're pointing. Oh, sorry.
I don't think you said this line when you married Donna and David, or you may have. I was so captivated by her.
Well said. Well said. Very good. All right, let's hear it for Robert. Okay.
But on a serious note, one of the things that's often said in the marriage vows is to take that person for better or for worse.
Yeah, that was in
Well,
there.
one of the worst things that can happen, is betrayal.
Well, this is from the Broadman minister. I was reading from the Broadman minister's manual that I've used all these many years to perform weddings and funerals. graveside services. The pastors don't make up those fancy words that are written down in a book for us. That's just a little inside information there. But yeah, it says we agree to marry our husband, our wife, for better or worse, in sickness and health, and forsaking all others. Now, the traditional Episcopal service that we often use says, and forsaking all others. This said, and do you promise to be true to her or to him? And so this is a vow we make, isn't it? Remember, when you got married, we repeated after the pastor, and will you be true to? I will. I'll be true to him. I'll be true to her. And of course, they didn't use this exact wedding ceremony in ancient Israel, but Hosea, like any other Hebrew husband, had a right to expect that his wife would be faithful, would be true to him. So it's interesting that verse 2 says, God said, and go and marry a woman of promiscuity. And the point was that sexual immorality was just a common thing in the northern kingdom of Israel. Well, two reasons for this. For one, godly morality had broken down, and the people were doing what seemed right to them. The other thing was King Ahab and his evil queen Jezebel had brought in the prophets of Baal and Asherah. Now, you've probably heard of the prophet Baal. These were the prophets, these were the gods of the Canaanites, the native people in the land. So Baal was the god of thunder, lightning, and rain. And so the people said, okay, well, if we're going to have rain, and remember, Israel's basically a desert place, if we're going to have enough rain to grow our food, we need to pray to Baal, the god of rain and thunder. His consort, the female god, was Asherah. She was the goddess of fertility. Okay? And so they said, well, if you want your crops to grow, you need to pray to Baal to send the rain. You need to pray to Asherah that your goats and sheep will reproduce and that your crops will grow. Goddess of fertility. Well, the problem was the temples to Baal and Asherah included temple prostitutes. And so just think about the people of Israel. What was their way of life before they came to Canaan and captured it under Joshua? How did they live? What was their job? Yeah, they were sheep herders, cattle herders, goat herders. They were herders. In Texas, we'd say they were ranchers. They kept animals. They herded sheep, goat, cattle. That's what they knew. Well, Joshua led them into the promised land. They captured the land of Canaan. Well, most of Canaan is not pasture land. In Canaan, there were wheat fields in Bethlehem, and there were olive groves around Jerusalem. There were vineyards. So now these herders have become farmers. Well, they were supposed to drive the Canaanites out of the land completely, weren't they? Remember, God told Joshua, run all these people out of the land, eradicate them from the land, lest they be a stumbling stone, a snare to your people. Well, they didn't do that. A lot of Canaanites remained. And so now you got Canaanites living side by side with the Israelites who have been sheep herders. Now they're farmers. Well, there wasn't any county agent to coach them up on how to raise grapes or olives or barley or wheat. They didn't know what to do. So they asked their neighbors, okay, how do we how do we raise wheat and barley? They said, oh, well, the first thing you need to understand is you need rain. And to get rain, you need to go over here to the temple of Baal, pray to him and to Asherah. And when they went over there, guess what they found? Temple prostitutes. And they're thinking, okay, we worship Asherah by having sexual relations with this temple prostitute. Well, you can see why God told them that allowing the Canaanites to remain in the land would be a temptation and a stumbling stone for them. And that really was the case. And so that's the background. That's the background. And Ahab, King Ahab, and his wife Jezebel, who was from the north, from Sidon, they brought in all of these prophets of Baal and Asherah. And the worship of them just exploded. And so that's why Elijah would say, well, Lord, I'm about the only one left who worships you. And remember, the Lord said, no, that's not right. There's still 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so that was the situation in which Hosea was operating here. So God told Hosea to marry this woman of promiscuity, a woman who lived in a culture, who lived in a situation where immorality was common and where temple prostitutes were common as well. So when God said to him, marry a woman of promiscuity, the land was filled with promiscuity, which is a fancy word for sexual immorality. And so God told Hosea to marry Gomer because he wanted him to better understand the message that God wanted him to communicate to the people. And by marrying Gomer and experiencing her betrayal and the hurt that came with that, Hosea understood the pain in God's heart at a very, very deep level. Now, how often do we talk to someone and we say, well, I know how you feel? Maybe someone said that to you. How often is that true? Oftentimes it's not true. Sometimes a person really does know. But oftentimes someone will say that, and what they mean is, I'm sorry you're feeling so sad. And we appreciate that, but it's not often that we really do understand how another person feels. But by experiencing Gomer's betrayal, Hosea he learned a profound understanding of how God felt by Israel's spiritual adultery. And then, as we said earlier, Hosea's marriage provided a living lesson to the people of Israel. And that's another thing we see in the prophets. The prophets often lived their lesson for the people. For example, if you studied Ezekiel, Ezekiel's wife died, and God said, don't mourn your wife. Another prophet went around without clothing for some time to make a point to the people. And so, many times the prophets lived out the lesson. Jeremiah went down to the potter's house. And so we see often the prophets obeying God and acting out the lesson for the people to understand. And that was certainly true of Hosea. Now, so Hosea did marry Gomer, and she bore him a son, whom they named Jezreel. God gave each of their three children their name. Now, that's a common thing in the Old Testament. God saying, okay, you'll name the child this, and New Testament as well. I listen to the New Testament when I go walking in the morning. I was listening the other day, God spoke to Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, said his name shall be called John. God gave him his name. When he was born, Zacharias said his name shall be John. Everybody said, why'd you choose that name? You don't have any family member named that. And the Lord enabled him to speak and said, his name's going to be John. They said, okay. But Jezreel was not a common name for a child. Jezreel was the name of a place. Miss Barbara and I just came back from a tour of Israel, and we went to the valley of Jezreel. The valley of Jezreel cuts through the middle, the northern part of the country. Basically, there's a line, a ridge line of tall hills or low mountains that bisects Israel from north to south. So you've got this ridge line that comes down from north to south. And the valley of Jezreel is the great passageway through that line of hills or mountains. And many ancient armies passed through there. The valley of Jezreel was a place where many ancient battles were fought because Israel was the crossroads of the ancient world. Now, that was good for commerce, bad for their military situation, because Israel was not a large nation by any means, and so you had very powerful kingdoms here in Mesopotamia, what's now Iraq. You had very powerful nations there. Egypt was very powerful. And so you had these two power centers, Egypt to the southwest, Babylon to the east. And so they often clashed. And as those armies moved from west to east or east to west, they passed through the valley of Jezreel. And so Israel was always in the way. You say, well, why didn't the Babylonians just go due west? Well, they couldn't because of the Arabian desert. They had to follow the Tigris and the Euphrates River up to what is now Damascus, and then down to Israel, and then on to Egypt. And that was where the rivers were. It's where water was available for the soldiers and the animals in the army. And so Israel was just in the path. They were at the crossroads of the ancient world. As I said, good for commerce, bad militarily, because they were always getting invaded. And they weren't very strong. And so generally they were being overrun by one powerful empire or another. So Jezreel was the name of that valley, not a common name, and it means make fertile. But as I said, there are many battles fought there. So even though the name Jezreel means fertile place, in the minds of the people, it had a connotation of a place of bloodshed, because there were so many battles fought there. And the book of Revelation tells us that that's where the battle of Armageddon will take place. The valley of Jezreel is overlooked by Armageddon, the mountain of Megiddo. And so the battle of Armageddon will take place there in the valley of Jezreel. So Hosea's son Jezreel represented the judgment that would come on the kingdom of Israel. And we know that the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, was captured by the kingdom of Assyria in 722. And where he talks about the breaking of Israel's bow, just means they won't be able to defend themselves. They had no hope of defending themselves against the powerful kingdom of Assyria. So then Gomer conceived a second time and gave birth to a daughter. And God told Hosea to name her Lo Ruhamah, which means not loved. Now, can you imagine naming a little girl not loved? Well, why did God tell Hosea to name the child that?
I think because they didn't love him.
Yeah,
More inspiration again.
yeah, yeah. God said, you know,
I can't imagine not loving my daughter or my granddaughter, you know?
yeah. Excuse me?
The word low, low.
Yes, or not. Yeah,
There's a church.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, if the people wondered why Hosea, or if Hosea had rejected his child, Hosea could answer, I have not rejected my daughter, but God has disavowed you. And so God was saying, you know, you've rejected me. And so I'm taking my hand off of you. And one thing we often misunderstand is that God's power restrains evil. So people say, oh, I just want God to leave me alone. Worst thing that could happen. Worst thing that could happen. When God removes his restraining hand, withdraws his restraining power, then evil and destruction flows in. And that's exactly what happened in Israel. God said, all right, you've rejected me. I'll just back away and I'll not restrain the evil power of the Assyrian kingdom anymore. And what happened is that the king of Assyria came, brought his army to the northern kingdom and said, all right, you need to bow down to me and become a servant kingdom and pay me heavy taxes and be under my control. He told the king, he said, okay, Hosea was the king at that time. He said, so the king of Assyria said, Shalmaneser the fifth, he said, all right, he told King Hosea, he said, if you'll submit to me and pay heavy taxes, then I'll let you remain as the king. And Hosea said, no, we're not going to do that. And they started fighting, but the Assyrians prevailed, and the capital city of Samaria held out 3 years under siege. Finally, it was captured, and the Assyrians deported all of the people of the northern kingdom. So the 10 northern tribes basically disappeared. They were just taken captive into the northern kingdom and dispersed, and we don't hear any more of them. But he said, it's interesting, what did he say in verse 7? Well, it says verse 6, he said, I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. I will certainly take them away. And that happened in 722. So Hosea was prophesying, he was predicting the fall of Samaria, 722, and that's exactly what happened. All the people were taken away. But he said, I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and I will deliver them by the Lord their God. I will not deliver them by bow, sword, or war, or by horses and cavalry. So what happened? Well, the Assyrians invaded Judah also, the southern kingdom of Judah, and captured all the towns, and the Assyrian army encamped outside of the city of Jerusalem. And so King Hezekiah and the people prayed to the Lord and said, we can't defeat the Assyrians. God, it's going to have to be you. And God heard their prayer. And the angel of the Lord went through the camp of the Assyrians one night and killed 185,000 of their soldiers. And King Sennacherib gathered up what was left and went back to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Now, that raises another question. Why did God show compassion to Judah and not to Israel? All right, God had promised to punish the northern kingdom. Okay, certainly true. All right. That's right.
They had been faithful. At some point, they weren't totally right.
Yeah. Yeah, Hezekiah was a good and godly king. And when Samaria was surrounded and besieged, King Hosea, the king of Israel, there in the north, he just tried to fight. How'd that work out for him? Not so good. They were defeated. Well, when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrian army, what did Hezekiah do? He prayed. He got the prophet Isaiah to pray to the Lord. He called him in and said, we got to do something here. We need the Lord. He's our only hope. And Isaiah said, well, you got that right. And so King Hezekiah said, well, pray to the Lord that he'll deliver us. And they did. They prayed, and God delivered them. And so that's why God had compassion on Judah, but not on the northern kingdom of Israel. So at this point, Gomer had a third child. And what was her name?
It was a son, wasn't it?
A son, yeah.
Lo-ami.
Lo-ami, yeah. Which means what? Yeah. Not pitied. Not my people. Or some would say not pitied. Yeah. So he said, you're not my people anymore. Whatever you are, you're not my people. Because you've rejected me. Not my people. So he said, you are not my people. I will not be your God. And so Hosea's relationship, his marriage to Gomer, was an illustration for the people of God's relationship with the people of Israel. But the names of Hosea's three children that he had with Gomer, each had meaning, prophetic meaning. Now look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Someone read that for us. You can read 3, 1 through 5.
Then the Lord said to me, go again and show love to a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Just as the Lord loves the Israelites, so they turn to other gods and love raising cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and 9 bushels of barley. I said to her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be promiscuous, or belong to any man, and I will act the same toward you. For the Israelites must live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, and without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days.
Okay, so Gomer lived with Hosea for several years. They had 3 children, Jezreel, Lo-ruhamah, Lo-ami, and then Gomer left and lived a promiscuous life, an immoral life. Many Bible scholars believe that she became a prostitute. It may be that she became a ordinary prostitute. It may be that she became a prostitute in a temple. She became a temple prostitute. No way to know for sure, but what is for sure is that she abandoned her family and lived an immoral life. And of course, this was a living illustration for the people of Israel that God was their spiritual husband, they were his bride. And you can see this in many of the prophets. For example, Isaiah chapter 5. The prophet Isaiah said, God says, haven't I been a faithful husband to you? But you have not been faithful to me. So it's not just Hosea that spoke in these terms. Other prophets use this same example. Of course, in the New Testament, the church is referred to as the bride of Christ. So the idea is God is the husband and his people as his bride. That's a theme that we see repeated again and again through the Bible. But in this case, what was the nature of the bride? What did she do? She was unfaithful. She ran off and lived a wanton, immoral life. We don't know what motivated her to do that. We're not told that detail or given that information in the story, but she did. And she ended up in a slave auction.
Yeah.
She ended up in a slave auction, and we're not told how that happened. Probably she had debts. And in ancient Israel, if you owed a debt, your creditor could have you personally sold in a slave auction to, recover what was owed. And so somehow or other, Gomer had incurred debts, and she was going to be sold in the slave auction. So just imagine, here's the prophet who goes down to the slave auction and purchases his own wife in a slave auction. And how much did she pay? What did she cost him?
15 shekels of silver
And 9
and
bushels.
a homer, 11 of barley.
Yeah, so the Bible commentary said maybe he didn't have enough silver, so he paid the rest in barley. We don't know, but he paid a lot of money to redeem or to rescue his wife, Gomer, from the slave auction. And so he went and bought her. Just imagine. Went and bought her and brought her home.
So embarrassed, just a loss of face and everything.
I mean, this was a public thing. These slave auctions were public events. And so, here's the local preacher, the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Samaria. He goes to the slave auction to purchase his wife, who had lived a wanton life, incurred these debts, and he purchases her. Amazing, amazing. And he did this at the Lord's command. Notice it says in chapter 3, verse 1, then the Lord said to me, go again, show love to a woman who is loved by another man. In other words, go love your wife who has been loved by another man. And he didn't sugarcoat it, who's been an adulteress. So she'd committed adultery. And then notice he said, just as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. You're thinking, what's raisin cakes got to do with this? Well, apparently raisin cakes were involved in the worship of Baal and Asherah. So God told Hosea, go and buy your wife at the slave auction and show love to her, even though she's betrayed you and committed adultery. Because I still love Israel, even though they've betrayed me and committed spiritual adultery. Amazing. And so he did. He went and bought her. And he said, okay, we're going to live together, but we're not going to have sexual relations. We're not going to live together as husband and wife. we're going to abstain from being together sexually for some time. And verses 4 and 5 explain, chapter 3, verses 4 and 5 explain the meaning of all this. So he said in verse 4, for the Israelites must live many days without a king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, and without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. So oftentimes in the Old Testament prophets, there's a pronouncement of judgment and doom, and then a word of hope for the future. So often this is the case, where there's a word of gloom and doom and judgment. God's going to bring judgment on you. You're going to suffer terrible punishment. But then there's a word of hope. And that's what we see here. He was talking about how they were going to be taken into captivity. But he says, verse 5, afterwards, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. Well, Donna referred to this earlier. What's this about? They will experience David their king. David was long dead. That's right. God had made a promise to David that his kingly line, his lineage, would endure forever. He said, the throne will never depart from your lineage, from your family. And this was fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ, who was born in Bethlehem, the city of David. Yeah. And we'll see later in the book of Micah, talks about how the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. And so, remember blind Bartimaeus sitting there in Jericho, he heard that Jesus was passing by. What did Bartimaeus cry out? Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And he did. And so the Old Testament presents over and over again prophecies that the Messiah would be the descendant of David, a second David, a perfect David, a king like David. And indeed, that's what the people of Israel, is one of the reasons they struggled to accept Jesus as the Messiah. They were thinking, okay, we're going to have a Messiah who's a king like David, a great warrior king, a great conquering king. And Jesus came as the suffering servant, and they said, wait a minute. He doesn't fit the mold. He doesn't fit our expectation. This is not what we were expecting. And of course, we know that Jesus came as the suffering servant in his first coming, but in his second coming, Jesus will come as what? Conquering king. So here we see a word of judgment and a word of hope. Well, let's apply this to our own lives. Do we ever make promises to the Lord? You ever make a vow to the Lord? Lord, from now on, I'm going to do better or different. And how often do we keep those promises? Or perhaps I should say, how long? Long time, short time? Yeah. Sadly, that's true, isn't it? I was thinking about that in the sermon this morning in Big Church. Brother Chris was talking about Romans chapter 1, present your bodies, Romans chapter 12, verse 1, present your bodies a living sacrifice. Well, our regional leader there in the Philippines spoke to us one year, and he said, well, he preached on that verse. He said, well, the problem with living sacrifices is they keep crawling off the altar. And there's a lot of truth to that. I remember hearing that. I remembered that these many years. That was 35, 40 years ago. I heard that. But I remembered that. And that's exactly right, isn't it? I mean, we have a high moment, we have a mountaintop spiritual experience. And we say, Lord, I'm going to rededicate myself. I'm going to serve you. I'm going to do this, do that. And we're sincere. We really mean that. And at that moment, we do consecrate ourselves. We do put ourselves on the altar as a living sacrifice to the Lord. But then the cares of life and the distractions of daily life, the cares of this world, we forget our vow, begin to slip, and then before long we're back where we began. So this is a reminder to us that we want to be faithful to the Lord, and not betray Him in any way.
I was also reminded of the